Level 1. At the foundation of the Allied coalition in World War II were the associated and minor allies, smaller nations that joined the fight against the Axis, but lacked the military or industrial power to shape global strategy. Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg were invaded in May 1940, yet their governments continued the war from exile, while resistance networks operated inside occupied borders. Greece repelled the Italian invasion in October 1940 before falling to Germany in April 1941, delaying Axis operations in the Balkans by crucial weeks. Yugoslavia resisted through partisan warfare under Tito, tying down over 300,000 Axis troops. New Zealand deployed over 140,000 personnel across North Africa, Italy and the Pacific. South Africa contributed nearly 335,000 soldiers to campaigns in East Africa and Europe. Brazil sent 25,000 troops to Italy in 1944. Ethiopia, liberated from Italian occupation in 1941, rejoined the Allies under Emperor Haile Selassie. These nations represented the outer ring of Allied cooperation, contributing soldiers, resources and moral legitimacy, yet always operating under the command structures of larger powers. Level 2. The second tier of Allied resistance in World War II consisted of occupied nations, governments in exile, and organised resistance movements, states that lost their sovereignty but refused to surrender. Poland, invaded in September 1939, established a government in exile in London that commanded over 200,000 troops fighting across multiple fronts, including the Battle of Britain and Monte Cassino. Czechoslovakia's exiled leadership coordinated intelligence networks and raised forces that participated in the siege of Tobruk and the liberation of France. Norway's government fled to Britain after the April 1940 invasion, maintaining a merchant fleet of over 1,000 ships critical to Allied supply lines. The Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle rallied colonial territories and fielded divisions in North Africa, Italy and the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Denmark contributed resistance cells and an underground network that saved thousands of Jews in 1943. These exiled governments represented defiance without territory, symbols of national survival coordinating soldiers, intelligence and hope, while their homelands remained under Axis control. Level 3. At the third tier stood the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, a nation that had been fighting Japan since the full-scale invasion in July 1937, years before World War II engulfed the globe. China tied down over 1 million Japanese troops across a vast theatre, preventing their deployment elsewhere in the Pacific. The nationalist government endured catastrophic losses, including the brutal Nanjing massacre in December 1937. Despite limited industrial capacity and internal conflict with communist forces, China maintained resistance through brutal campaigns like the Battle of Changsha and the defense of Chongqing. By 1945, Chinese forces had suffered over 15 million military and civilian casualties. China represented endurance under impossible conditions, a major Allied power absorbing relentless punishment, while keeping Japan's armies locked in a grinding, unwinnable war on the Asian mainland. Level 4. At the fourth tier stood the Soviet Union, the dominant Allied power on the Eastern Front and the nation that bore the heaviest burden of World War II. Germany invaded in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, deploying over 3 million troops in the largest land invasion in history. The Soviets suffered catastrophic early losses, but held at Moscow in December 1941. The turning point came at Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943, where the Red Army destroyed Germany's Sixth Army. Soviet industry relocated eastward, producing over 100,000 tanks and 130,000 aircraft. By 1945, Soviet forces captured Berlin in May. The USSR suffered over 27 million casualties, nearly half of all World War II losses. The Soviet Union represented endurance and industrial mobilization, the force that defeated Germany on the Eastern Front. Level 5. At the fifth tier stood the United Kingdom, Dominions, and British India. A global network that fought across every theatre of World War II from September 1939 onward. Britain withstood the German air campaign during the Battle of Britain in 1940, preventing invasion. The Royal Navy secured vital Atlantic supply routes against U-boat attacks, while British forces fought across North Africa, defeating Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942. The Dominions contributed significantly. Canada deployed over 1 million personnel, Australia fielded forces in the Pacific and Mediterranean, and British India raised the largest volunteer army in history with over 2.5 million soldiers. Britain served as the staging ground for D-Day on June 6, 1944, launching the liberation of Western Europe. The United Kingdom represented global coordination and strategic positioning, the foundation upon which Allied operations were built. Level 6. At the sixth tier stood the United States, the industrial powerhouse that transformed the Allied war effort after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. American factories became the arsenal of democracy, producing over 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. The Lend-Lease program delivered over $50 billion in military aid to Allied nations, sustaining Britain and the Soviet Union. American forces fought across two theatres, in Europe, landing at Normandy in June 1944 and pushing toward Germany, and in the Pacific, island hopping from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The Manhattan Project culminated in atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender. The United States represented unprecedented industrial mobilization and military reach, the force that tipped the global balance decisively toward Allied powers. Level 7. At the very top of the Allied hierarchy stood the Grand Alliance Command Architecture, the coordinated leadership structure binding the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union into a unified strategic force during World War II. This alliance formalized through landmark conferences. Tehran in November 1943, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin coordinated the opening of a second front in Europe. Yalta in February 1945, where they planned Germany's occupation and the United Nations framework. And Potsdam in July 1945, finalizing Japan's surrender terms. The combined chiefs of staff integrated American and British military planning, while liaison missions maintained communication with Moscow. Despite ideological differences between Western democracies and Soviet communism, the three powers divided operational theatres, shared intelligence, and synchronized massive offensives that crushed the Axis from multiple directions. The Grand Alliance represented pragmatic cooperation on a global scale. Three powers with conflicting visions united by necessity to defeat fascism and reshape the post-war world order.